The method of self-inquiry, by posing the question, who am I? Or what am I? Was made most famous in the 20th century by Ramana Maharshi. It was through the publication of his talks that this idea of self-inquiry in that form became fashionable in the Western world. One way to look at this method and to look at this question is to ask some other questions. For example, before you even pose this thought, this question to yourself, before your mind generates this question, who are you? What are you? Right before you speak, right before you utter the first syllable of the first word of the first sentence, whenever you speak, who are you? What are you? What is there before that happens? Right before you move, before you make the first little movement to get out of bed in the morning, before you take the first step across the room, before you start to lift your hand to reach for something, who are you? What is there right before that? And the same with emotions. Right before you respond to something that happens in your life, by cloaking yourself in an emotion or a variety of emotions, before you adapt that persona, an emotional persona, and a way of responding and reacting and expressing yourself emotionally, before all of that starts, who are you? What is there? And this applies across the board to the five senses. Before you see, before you look through your eyes to see something, before you hear, before your five senses engage as touch and taste and smell, right before that instant, before these things happened, who are you? All of these things, talking, speaking, moving, sensing through the five senses, happen so fast, and we are so accustomed to them that we go for the ride. They are like different rides at the fair. We go from one to another and we jump on them immediately and go for a ride and fail to recognize who we are and what we are before we jumped on. When you look at infants, especially before they can walk and talk, you can see there's a presence behind their eyes, inside their eyes. They cannot formulate thought yet. They cannot manage to walk on their own. They're not coordinated. They don't have enough balance. They've not yet developed any complex emotions which they associate with their sense of as an ego. And they don't attach as a feeling of I to their five senses. Yes, they feel taste and touch and smell, and they hear things and see things, and they're affected by all of these things. But they haven't yet associated a sense of I with that. However, there's in them this presence of being. It's a silent, and even though you can sense it, you can see it. You can see, let's say you can see the reflection of it. You can't actually see it itself. There is a being inside that body and inside that still yet to be formed mind. And this was the case with each of us. Who is that? What is that? That silence of being that is motionless, silent, invisible, is in everyone. And the teachings of enlightenment and awakening and spirituality, all of them are talking about this silence of being, realizing itself, knowing it is there, cognizing itself, not only before we speak and before we move and before we emote and before we taste and touch, but during all those things as well. In other words, to remain conscious, to remain aware, to remain awake, to remain consciously cognizant, consciously self-realized, while all the rest of the human experience unfolds. Interestingly, as you get older, there's a tendency to forget a word. If you're talking, you forget the word you want to say, or you can't think of the right word, or you lose your train of thought completely. You're talking about something, you go off just briefly on a tangential thought, and you can't find your way back to the original track of what you were thinking about or talking about. And many people panic slightly about this and feel something is wrong. But in fact, those moments offer the chance for this silence of being to basically be there in us alone, without attachment to thought, without attachment to expectation, without attachment to an emotional concern about how we are being perceived by others. This beingness can just be. Who is that? What is that? And behind all of these things, behind the five senses, behind our movements and emotions and our thoughts and our talking, behind all of these, we develop a feeling of I. We develop the habit of forming ourselves into the feeling of I whenever we talk or walk or even listen or touch and taste. Therefore, another way to approach self-inquiry, to approach this question of who am I, is to pose the question, who am I before I become the feeling of I in the mind and body? What is that? How well does that know itself?